In this advanced module about composition, we're going to learn a few key factors about wide-angle photography, telephoto photography, focus stacking, using foreground elements. There's a lot to uncover inside this module, but we're going to start basic and progressively work ourselves a little bit harder. So right now I want to talk about wide-angle photography. This is generally in full frame terms, 16mm to 35mm equivalent. It can obviously be 14mm, so anything around that is wide angle. Before that is classified as ultra wide angle. Today we're going to start very basic and very simple. We're going to shoot this lesson for wide angle photography and the next lesson, telephoto photography at the same beautiful scene here. The reason behind that is I want to show the differences in focusing, what we want to try and get in the composition in our scene, where to focus, our settings in camera, to understand what's different and what we're basically looking for when capturing the image. Now for this image, I haven't got really any foreground element. That is on purpose because later down the line inside this module, we're going to get into focus stacking and also using foreground elements. So I want to take out that little bit of a harder, more difficult factor inside of this lesson and just concentrate on what we're photographing in this scene. Now, generally, when photographing wide-angle photography, it's a lot easier to start off with, and that is generally why people get into wide-angle photography in landscape and nature photography when they first start. The reason behind that is the composition speaks for itself. We can photograph a big, beautiful scene like we are right now and fit everything inside of the composition. And secondly, when we focus, it's a lot easier to grab focus on something because our field of view is really, really wide. We don't have to worry about a focusing point inside the image. Although it is crucial, if we do make a mistake, it's generally a lot easier. Also, getting onto the exposure module, when we photograph with a wide angle, we've got deep shadows, bright highlights. So we've got that wider field of view once again. It's a lot easier to put all the exposure or all the amount of light into the sensor to capture a more dynamic image compared to a telephoto. But we're going to get onto that a little bit more. So what I'm going to do now is set my camera settings up. And we want to work on that exposing to the right again. But before we get into the exposing to the right, we want to go 160 ISO to lower that noise. We want to go to f8 for that aperture to give a really big depth of field. And also we want to make sure that we're focusing. So I've got the village in front of me here and the mountains in the background, but due to focus peaking, when I focus on the middle part of the frame, I'm getting everything in focus. Once again, that's because of wide angle photography, it's a lot easier to focus. Now I want to muck around with the shutter speed to work out the histogram that we're exposing to the right. So currently, when I'm on f8 160 ISO, if I go to 1/10, maybe even just a little bit more to 1/8, I'm exposing to that right-hand side perfectly for this image. And when I look on the left-hand side of the histogram, I'm not crushing any blacks. That means I'm getting all the exposure, the dynamic range inside of one image. So now I can go through and put a 2-second timer on and just capture that image. That is how simple it is to use wide angle photography. Now we are going to get a little bit more difficult, as I said, with using foreground elements and focus stacking. But when you're first starting out, it's really good to shoot to that 16mm and 35mm when we're first starting out with our nature and landscape photography. Telephoto photography in nature and landscape photography. What are the key aspects that we need to be looking for in the composition, and what are the best camera settings to use to capture those zoomed images? Now on the previous lesson, we were out at the same scene photographing but with wide angle photography. In wide angle photography, as you seen in the last lesson, we capture the whole entire composition. When the viewer views that image, no questions need to be asked because they can see the entire scene in front of them. But when we move on to a zoomed lens, we have to basically flip that completely around and just focus on key aspects inside the scene. So today I'm focusing just on the church in front of me and one of the highest mountains in the country that I'm photographing in. And we're going to be concentrating on just these two elements inside the composition. Because in the composition module, I explained to you about focus stacking, using light, using scale for our images. And that is what I'm going for right now. Unfortunately, we're just losing the light right now, but I've got scale of the church. Everyone knows how big a church, or roughly how big a church is, but the mountains are almost 3,000 meters. So we want to try and portray that in our telephoto photography. So right now I've got a zoom lens on, shooting in landscape orientation. So the best settings that you want to use are the same settings that we use for all our landscape images. The lowest ISO, so 160 for me, f8, around that f8 to f11 aperture, and then we're going to determine our shutter speed that we've done throughout this entire duration of this course. So for me right now, shooting at f8 and also 160 ISO, I'm getting around 1/4 seconds. So you can see the light is really dissipated right now. But what I want to compare to you also is not just about the scene, but also how we put our camera on the tripod. And I'm going to explain it to you right now. Because what we try and do in telephoto photography is get less mess in the image. And that's what I want to explain to you today. Trying to get the most zoom and the less questions that people can answer. So we want someone to look at this image and ask basically what is around and what is to the left, what is to the right. So when I set my camera up in landscape orientation and try and take an image, you can see it's going to cut off the top and also bottom of the image. You can see right now. This is just for display purpose. Obviously, I'll have to change lenses, zoom out a little bit, but to the left and right hand side of me, I've got so much empty space. So what we're going to do right now is flip this into portrait orientation, because that was shooting at 55mm for me. But what I want to try and do now is zoom in as far as I possibly can and just put the church at the bottom and the mountain clipping in the top. Trying to use those rule of thirds, but we may break this rule right now. So I'm going to zoom all the way in, and you can see 55mm before, now we're almost 90mm, completely different what we're trying to get at. So if we had some light, this would be an absolutely beautiful image. Now we're going to shoot that f8 160 ISO, and that is giving me a 1/26 at f8. So I can go ahead and just get this composition down packed. So I'm trying to put the church all the way to the bottom of the frame and then leaving about 1/5 of the sky, because there's not a lot of color in the sky right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take that single image to show you right now with a 2-second timer. This is very, very important when we're shooting with telephoto, because when we're shooting with a wide angle like we did in the previous lesson, at f9 we've got a really big depth of field. But because our depth of field is a lot smaller here, I want to focus on the subject, which is the church. So I'm focusing on the church. But because we are zooming in, so around that 100mm, anytime I touch the tripod, it's going to make those movements really, really big. So we want to make sure we've either got a 2-second timer or even a 10-second timer put into your camera. So now when I go to push that trigger on a 2-second timer, it's going to wait 2 seconds, the tripod is going to go completely still, and then take the image. That is very, very important. So here is that image you can see right now that we've just taken. You can see the difference between shooting from landscape and vertical. What we're trying to do here is not trying to shoot vertical or not trying to shoot landscape. As I said, we're trying to get rid of all this outside material inside of our composition and focus on just 2 or 3 simple elements. So we're actually trying to make the image very minimalistic. So wide angle, we want to try and tell the whole story. With zoomed or telephoto photography, we want to try and tell only part of the story. That is the best way I can describe telephoto photography. Now don't be annoyed if you do go out and try and fail with telephoto photography. It took me almost 2 years to start to understand and grasp the understanding of how to photograph with telephoto photography. But the best thing you can do is start, because once you go out, you're going to start seeing compositions completely different to capturing with telephoto photography, and it's going to set your photography completely apart. In this lesson, we're going to take a deep dive into focus stacking out in the field. What are the best settings in camera and some tips and tricks whilst out in the field to get razor sharp images from the near foreground all the way to the far background. Now, because this is a little bit more complicated, I have split it up into 2 sections. Today, we're out in the field learning all the in-camera settings. Then the last module inside of this course, we're going to go through the tips and tricks in post-production. Now, I have given you additional images for the post-production technique. I'm also going to include all these raw images today, so you can practice with me one-on-one in the editing tutorial, and then outside of the editing tutorial, you can play around with these images in post-production. Therefore, before you go out and take your own images, you know exactly what to do out in the field from today's lesson, then in the last module, exactly what to do in post-production. Now, in today's lesson, we've got our tripod in a very awkward position, hanging upside down because we're focusing on this really big mushroom here. Now, if I was just to focus on this mushroom, everything in the far background would be blurry. In today's lesson, I want to explain to you how we can get razor sharp images from the very foreground of this mushroom to the midground of the rocks and to the trees in the far background by taking multiple images. Now, this will depend a lot on the camera gear you have, because I have a lens that will focus within about 25 to 30 centimeters of the near subject. So you have to find out what your lens will focus, the minimum focusing distance, because this will apply to how close you can get out in the field to your subject. Now, I am also using a wide angle lens to emphasize the foreground and also emphasize the background. This is a little tip. The wider you shoot, as I said, it's easier to focus, easier for exposure, and also when we're focus stacking out in the field, as you'll see today, it emphasizes the size of this mushroom. So I've gone through and hung my camera upside down, and what I'm also trying to do is get a little bit of angle tilted on the actual lens and camera. What this will do is segregate the foreground and the background and make them look a little bit closer than what they are, which is what we're trying to achieve out in the field. So now we want to go through and understand the settings that we're going to use in our nature focus stacking photography. We want to apply very similar settings to that 160 ISO. And here, we're not going to shoot definitely at f8. We might actually boost it up to f11. We're going to find that out very shortly. A couple of more things that I want to go through and lock down in camera is the white balance. Because we're going to take multiple images from foreground to midground and background, as I said, we don't want our white balance to change in between that. So we're just going to go through and lock down that white balance. I'm going to set mine for a daytime temperature. So I know when I take that images all the way through, bring them into post-production for you guys, they're going to be all the same color, which is what we're after. Now I want to have a look on the back of the screen, and I want to go to the closest focusing point. Now for me, I always start near and work my way back. This is just something I do, and this will differ if you do have external lighting. So I've come into a little bit of a forest here because it's going to eliminate those really high highlights and dark shadows. We've got a pretty neutral, overcast sort of day here, very good exposure. So I want to go all the way down and focus on the nearest point to me there, and then I'm actually going to go through and just hit autofocus. Now because I have focus peaking on my camera, I can see that this is in foreground focus and also how far back the focusing goes. Now this is at f8. I can actually bump this up to f11 and it's going to increase that depth of field. So I'm going to shoot actually this image at f11, because if we were to shoot at f8, we might get halfway through the mushroom, then the next image get to the rock, then to the foreground, then to the background. But if we shoot at f11, I can now get the whole mushroom in focus. So there's one image, another image focused on the midground and background. So we're actually eliminating what we have to do in post-production. So that's going to make sense as we go through this tutorial. So 160 ISO, now shooting at f11 rather than f8 to expand that depth of field. We've locked down our white balance, so we know when we change through this, it's not going to change as we take multiple images, very similar to the panoramic that we've taken earlier. So we're going to go through and put a 2-second timer, and it's going to give me 1.5 of a shutter speed, and my histogram is reading out very well. So I'm going to push that, it's going to give a 2-second timer and capture that image. Now before we go and change our focusing point, I want to give you one pro tip on how to help you out in post-production. I'm going to go through and point on the camera where my focusing point was. I'm going to take another image exactly the same. So it's captured that image, and you're probably wondering why I'm doing that. Because we're taking multiple images, when we put it into post-production in Lightroom, they're going to look extremely similar. especially on the bottom, the thumbnail will look really, really small, and we might actually delete images that we need. So if we take an image, put our finger there, and now we can move to the next focusing point. After that, we'll take another image with our finger on there also. So I'm actually going to go into the playback, and what I want to do is go back to the image without my finger in it and zoom up and find out where my focusing is, because we don't want to fully trust focus peaking. So I can tell right now the beginning of the mushroom just here is really sharp, but actually the back of the mushroom where the focus peaking did tell me it was in focus isn't fully sharp. So we're going to go and focus on the back of the mushroom now. So we just have to remember we went from F8 to F11. If I went to F8, I might have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 images at F8. We want to expand that depth of field. But remember, in the aperture module, very, very early on, we spoke about going to F22. Yes, it's going to give us a really big depth of focus, but we're going to get really negative effects. We want to stick around that F8 to F11. So once again, I'm going to focus on the back of this tree, on the back of this mushroom here, and I can tell a lot more comes in focus. We're going to take another image with a 2-second timer on, and we've captured that image. Now straight away, I'm going to put my finger once again on where I was focusing and capture that another image. So we now have 2 images, but only this near foreground is in focus. So what I want to do now is look where my focus peaking sort of eliminates, and it's telling me it's eliminating about just here. So what I'm going to do, just to be safe, this is pro tip number 2 in focus stacking. So the first one is putting our finger there. The second one is we're better to shoot too many images than not enough. It's the same as a panoramic. Shoot too many images than not enough. Now, there is obviously a limit. We don't want to shoot 50 images because it's going to make our post-production time a hassle, very, very big hassle. So just to be safe, I'm going to focus on this rock just here. So I'm going to go up another 2 steps, and as soon as I focus on that rock, I can tell a lot of this foreground, mid-ground area, not as far as the trees, but just sort of this mid-ground area here is a lot more in focus. So I'm going to go through once again and catch that with a 2-second timer for our third image. Then we're going to go through and put our finger once again to capture this image, to take it into post-production. Now I'm just going to keep repeating this all the way so I get enough images. The next image I'm going to do is just that rock just there. Another 2-second timer to catch that image for our fourth image now. And once again to repeat that, just to give that pro tip, put my finger there. Now I'm actually going to take a 5th image. I personally don't think I need to, because it is showing in the background that those trees are lit up. But just to be on the safe side, I'm going to go all the way to the far, far tree in the background and focus on that. And it is telling me from the bar down the bottom that I am focusing to infinity now. So a lot more is in focus. So I'm going to catch that 5th image just to make sure. So let's say we shot at that F8 or F7.1. We might have to shoot 6 or 7 images. That means more post-production time, or it means more mistakes could be made in camera. So if we want to try and eliminate post-production time and also eliminate those mistakes. So once again, I'm just going to point to the sky and capture that image. So you can see now I have got 5 images for focus stacking. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the far, far background. Now, if we want to be a little bit more precise, especially if I want to print this image, I would probably go through and focus on the foreground of the mushroom, the middle of the mushroom, and also the back of the mushroom. And the reason I would do this is because the mushroom actually goes like this. So we have to remember that F11, because we are focusing so close, we want to make sure that center of the mushroom is really, really sharp. So what I'm actually going to do is just to go back into my playback and find the images where I was focusing on the mushroom, and I want to go to the far background one of the mushroom. And here I'm just going to check what it looks like in the background. And you can see when I zoom up to 100%, how much of it is in focus and how much of it isn't. And I can tell right now I have overlapped those focusing points, which is really, really important. So just to recap, we want to lock down our ISO to the lowest or whatever suits our conditions. We want to try and shoot on the higher end of that f11, or if you are using a full frame camera, f13, maybe f16, depending on the lens that you are using. Very, very important to lock down that white balance. So for me, daylight. Pro tip number 1, point after taking one image. Pro tip number 2, maybe take 1 or 2 extra images that you don't think you'll need, because you can always delete them later. But the more you shoot and the more you focus stack, the more you'll understand each lens. That is the number 3 tip I can give you. Each lens will be very different, and also if you're using telephoto and wide angle. But this is how to shoot focus stacking to get the best possible results out in the field. In this lesson, I want to teach you one of my favorite types of photography inside the niche of nature and landscape photography, and that is how to shoot a panoramic image. There's multiple reasons why I love to shoot a panoramic, because we want to come out sometimes and tell a complete story of the landscape that we're trying to capture. But when we photograph with a wide angle lens, we're getting too much of the foreground and too much of the background or the sky in focus, which we don't want sometimes in our photography. Also, when shooting wide angle, it doesn't give us a really good representation of the environment that we're in. So when we shoot panoramic, it allows us to use a more telephoto lens and compress that image, telling us a completely different story. But to shoot a panoramic photography, you have to do a few key elements correct to make sure when we bring it into post-production, like we're going to in the last module of this course, that everything is going to flow together. It's going to make it a lot easier in our post-production software. The first one I want to touch on is the legs. The legs of the tripod have to be completely level. Now, right now I'm photographing on an uneven terrain. I've got this spirit level here. It's a replacement neck that allows me to shoot panoramic photography a lot easier. So I can undo this bottom handle here and move the ball head completely independent to the legs. So if you are interested in shooting panoramic photography, or this does interest you, I highly recommend to invest into a spirit level neck replacement for your tripod, if your tripod can have one. There are other alternatives out there which I highly recommend to look into. So for me, I can just unloosen this handle and move this spirit level to it is completely flat. Now this has allowed me to not level my tripod legs, but just to level the ball head. I still have to go one step further and make sure on the ball head that my camera is level. This means when I go from left to right, I'm following the horizon line, because as I said, when we get into post-production, we want to make sure we're going to stitch a really long image together that it's going to flow together very easily. So that is the first thing. If it takes you 15-20 minutes to level your tripod on an uneven surface, trust me, it's 100% worth it for when you get into post-production. I'd rather be out in the field here, leveling my tripod, than spending the same amount of time in post-production sitting in front of a computer trying to fix it. This is a guarantee fix. The next one I want to go through is I like to shoot in vertical composition. The reason behind this is I'm going to get more of the foreground and also more of the sky or background. As I said before, we shoot wide angle for this, and I don't want this, but we have got a telephoto photography here, so I'm compressing that image. That's not the main reason why I shoot in vertical. If I show you this image now, I've shot 3 images in landscape, and when I stitch them together, I haven't got as much to play around with. And what I mean by play around with is crop from the top to bottom, because we're never going to take an image that's absolutely perfect for panoramic photography. We always have to crop in post-production. Therefore, rather than shooting 3 in landscape, I would rather come out and shoot 5 images in vertical, giving me more of that sky, more of the foreground, and allowing me to crop. Because when we obviously take these images, we try and print them and hang them on the wall. So we want to make sure we're getting a panoramic stitch that is stitching together properly firstly, and then we can put into an aspect ratio that we can print. I find for me, it's very, very good. And I find if I shoot in odd numbers, so 3, 5, 7, 9 images across, this generally works out very well for me when I go into post-production. So first of all, we've leveled our tripod and leveled our camera to make sure it's perfect. Now I've put it in vertical composition. What I want to do here is I'm going to give you a pro tip when shooting panoramic photography, and that is we're going to get two images, one panoramic and one single image. We're photographing this beautiful church here with the mountains in the background. What I'm going to do is basically line the camera up as if I'm shooting a single image. So I'm shooting just the church and just the mountain in the background. From there, I'm going to get all my settings correct. So for me right now, I'm shooting at f8 to give us that really great depth of field. I'm shooting with a plus 0.6 EV compensation, which we spoke about already, to give me an exposure to the right in the histogram. This is giving me 1/55 seconds in the shutter speed. Now I want to make sure this is completely locked down, including my white balance, because we're going to move from left to right and conditions will change as we move from left to right, especially the exposure. So I don't want to make sure I'm in automatic. I want to make sure I'm in manual mode for everything. Now, the next thing is focusing. For that single image, we're going to, as I said, take a single image for this. So I'm going to set my focusing point on the church itself. Now, before I take an image there, what I'm going to do is just move the camera from left to right and visualize what I'm going to take. Because there's one golden rule when shooting panoramics, is to overshoot. The reason I say to overshoot is because we can always crop back in post-production, as I just spoke about. So when we go from left to right, I generally go from left to right. It doesn't matter if you go from right to left. So from left to right, I always shoot more than I want to. So if I want to shoot the image to the left-hand side here, I want the image to be cropped there in post-production. So I'm going to go 33% or 1/3 extra to the left-hand side. This will be my first image. And then on the next image, I'm going to overlap 1/3. So for each image across, I'm going to shoot 5 images across. I'm going to have a 1/3 or 33% overlap. The reason I do this is because the software in post-production likes that 33% overlap to stitch all those images together. So just to recap, we've leveled our tripod and leveled our camera. I shoot in vertical personally, but possibly you could shoot some images in horizontal if you did want to, or in landscape orientation. We've then gone through and set all our camera settings for a single image. For me, just the church and the mountains in the background. Then to the left-hand side, I've gone to where I want it to be cropped in post-production, 33% extra, and then got 5 images that have overlapped. But that middle image, that third image that I've captured will be a single image. So now I've got a panoramic image and a single image that I can take home and edit, which is an absolutely perfect thing. So we're going out in the field and getting 2 beautiful images to take home. This is why I love panoramic photography and why I highly recommend you go out and practice this. The only way you can learn panoramic photography is going out and practicing, making mistakes and learning in post-production. We're going to take these images into post-production and learn exactly how to edit them in Adobe software. Creating scale in nature and landscape photography is one of the most difficult aspects to get correct. But the good thing is, once we know how to do it and understand the benefits behind it, it sets our photography away from being an amateur to that more professional feel. We've already done this in the previous parts of this course without even realizing. Photographing cities or photographing churches, as you can see right now, this is a way to indicate the scale inside of landscape photography. Because if we're photographing like we have previously inside this course, this beautiful cave right in front of me, we can't tell the size of the cave because obviously the person not looking at the image or not capturing the image was never there. So as photographers, we're trying to portray scale inside of our photography to someone that wasn't there. When they look at this image, they're going to feel the scale, the adventure, or what it felt like to be there. But previously, we photographed the churches and the cities. But sometimes we come out in nature and there's nothing around. So we can't obviously create that scale because if I was to photograph with this tree right in front of me, you have no idea how big this tree is. So what I'm going to do right now is run down into the middle of the cave and stand there for scale. This is not traditional landscape photography, but for me, I feel that it really adds a sense of scale and also adventure. If someone was looking at this image, it can give them an indication of what it felt like to be there standing in that location. And also secondly, we as humans know how tall generally humans are to give that representation of scale of what we're trying to achieve in this type of photography. So with composition, we're basically going to photograph the cave as we've previously done inside of this course. We're also going to exposure bracket, which we learned previously inside this course at this location. But right now, the one thing I want to change is the focusing point, because we've spoken previously about focusing and how we want to make sure the subject in the image, which is now going to be me, is razor sharp, the sharpest possible inside of this composition. So I'm still shooting at f8, exposure bracketing for 3, so +2, 1, and 0, like we've previously done inside this course, 160 ISO. I'm going to set a 10-second timer and then run down inside the image and capture this image and stand very still. So I'm going to show you now the previous image that we've captured at this location. And it looks very good, and you can tell that it's a nature and landscape image. But what it's missing is that sense of scale, which is what we're trying to achieve in this advanced composition. So now if I blend myself over top of this image, you can see the cave becomes a lot bigger and it adds depth into the image. So yes, we're creating scale, but we're also creating depth in the image because we've got a human element or a sense of scale in this. So whenever you can, or you're missing an element, so we haven't got as much light here, I can add a human element in there to get that sense of scale, and that's the third element we need to capture our nature and landscape images. It's a great way to set yourself apart if you haven't got something in the environment. In this lesson, I want to show you how you can create beautiful and simple images using minimalistic photography. We're out photographing just after sunrise, and although we haven't got those perfect conditions for sunrise that we're used to shooting, we've got very heavy fog. And using minimalistic photography with different focal ranges and orientation, any beginner photographer can create unique and stunning images from any nature and landscape scene. So in front of me, I've got a church with a beautiful reflection image. We're going to be creating just a very simple and minimalistic image of the church, utilizing the conditions we have, very heavy fog. Although minimalistic images don't have to be just with heavy fog, there are other ways we can create these minimalistic, unique images, but I'm going to touch on that later in this lesson. So right now I'm framed up in landscape orientation, and I want to shoot around that 35 millimeters. But unfortunately, the composition doesn't work very well because I've got the middle of the church and the reflection in the middle of the image. And remember, we want to try and get those key subjects on 1/3 of those rule of thirds that we explained earlier inside of this course. So I'm going to go through and take an image in landscape to make sure when we go home, we can play around with it in the editing software just to learn from our composition skills. Now, one thing about the composition is I've got this tree on the right-hand side here, and I have to choose whether I want to implement this into my composition or get rid of it. And the way I can do that is simply just by using the different focal range, so between 23 and 35 millimeters. I'm breaking that other rule of thirds. So I spoke about the one rule of third, putting the church in the verticals, but in the horizontal, I want to put the reflection dead smack in the middle. So we're going to go through and do that right now. Now, if I want to put this tree in the composition, I'm shooting at 23 millimeters, and you can see that image right now. Although it is a very nice image, we're trying to create minimalistic photography. So what I'm going to try and do now is switch my camera into vertical composition to see what we can come up with here. And what this is going to allow me to do is use a larger focal range. So rather than shooting that 23 mil quite wide open, we're going to recompose, and we're going to now go to the end of our focal range. And this is the same. We're putting that one rule of third of the church on the right-hand side and the reflection perfectly in the middle. Now, I can go through now, and I'm composed almost at 50 millimeters. So we're compressing and also eliminating what is in the composition. So I can go through and take this image right now, as you can see, and it creates a lot more minimalistic photography. So what is minimalistic photography? It's basically getting all the clutter out of the composition and using the conditions that you have. So today we have fog, and you can go through and get really heavy fog and just concentrate on subjects, breaking that rule of third, putting things on the horizon line and dead smack in the middle, as you can see of Lake Bled Island right now. It's breaking those rule of thirds from the conditions you've got. But you can also create minimalistic photography by using telephoto photography. So eliminating all that clutter and just concentrating on one subject, whether it's a castle or whether it's a little cottage in the middle of nowhere, we can create these beautiful, minimalistic images by using telephoto or the heavy fog that we have around us. Another way to go through and create minimalistic photography with the conditions that you haven't got is by using long exposure. We've touched about using ND filters previously inside this course, so you can make your own minimalistic images by making the clouds move or flattening out the water if there's ripples in the water, and even changing it to black and white is another great way to make minimalistic images. So you can see any beginner photographer can go out and utilize the conditions we have to create minimalistic, unique, and beautiful images of any nature and landscape.